In this video, we'll look at another recipe for creating electronic music. The approach we'll explore here enables you to create a sound narrative through two concepts pioneered by British composer Trevor Wishart: the notion of sound symbols and sound transformation. American composer Max Neuhaus put forward the idea that how we feel about a place is informed as much, if not more, by what we hear than by what we see. This concept is used widely in horror movies to amplify the horror through unseen but heard monsters or inarticulate sounds outside a room where a protagonist is quaking in fear, waiting for something to happen. Wishart used similar concepts to create music that forms a purely auditory world where the listener is immersed in different sounds and move rapidly through different scenes to create a narrative. Through listening to your recordings in previous weeks, you probably realise that once you record a sound and remove it from its source, it's often hard to tell what actually made the sound. Listening to the sound's attributes separated from their source is a central idea in music concrete, which was explored by Stephen in our first recipe. Wishart thought about using sound in composition somewhat differently. Rather than throwing away the source of the sound or the connotations that the source might bring to a piece of music, Wishart's approach was to think about what the sound might mean in building up a composition, both considered in the context of its source and how that source might contribute to overarching metaphorical ideas. He was particularly taken with the way that the flicking pages of a book sound similar to the sound of a flock of birds taking off, and the connections that might be found between these two sounds. When selecting ingredients for our sound narrative recipe, it's important to think about sounds that could be used as symbols in our story, that sound interesting in their own right and also might spawn multiple different ideas or meanings for the listener in the oral world that we are creating. Using Wishart's two sounds mentioned previously, we can think about them in multiple ways. For example, the sound of birds taking off might be a literal flock of birds taking off. It might imply that the listener is in an outdoor space. Metaphorically, it might imply the freedom of flying or the protagonist of our story flying to freedom. And once the listener has realised that there is a flock of birds in our oral world, the birds might do things, like singing for example. The sound of the flicking pages of the book could also be thought about in a similar way. For example, the protagonist in our story could literally be flicking through the pages of a book. The book might imply that we are in an indoor space. Metaphorically, the book contains ideas, and they might spark off ideas in the protagonist of our story or in the listener. And again, once the listener realises that there is a book, then the book might do other things, such as the protagonist in our story might use it to try and swat a fly. When thinking about choosing your ingredients for your sound narrative, you probably only need 3 or 4 sounds that you'll use as the main symbols in your work, given that this week's task is only 2 minutes long. Try to think about sounds that might be able to spawn multiple ideas about the context of using the sound, like the 2 sounds that we've discussed. There may then be other sounds that you fit around these main symbols to help build up the scenes of your story, but the 3 or 4 sounds that you initially choose should be able to be manipulated to create the main structure of the work. In your narrative, there may be 1 or 2 short scenes. The method that we use in our recipe is based on the concept of sound transformation. With modern computers, it is quite straightforward to morph one sound into another using a process called convolution, where the spectrum of one sound is applied to another. But Wishart devised 2 methods for transforming sound, which he called continuous transformation and sequential transformation. His approach worked with the limitations of the tape-based studio that he was working with at the time. A continuous transformation we would think of now as a crossfade, and it can be created by layering 2 sounds and then automating the volume between them so that one sound fades out while the other fades in. This transformation is quite straightforward. What's interesting is that you start with a definite sound and the listener knows what the sound is. As the sound transforms, new sounds are created and the listener isn't quite sure what they are hearing, and then as we arrive at the destination sound, the listener realises that actually the sound is now something else. Sequential transformations are more complex and are built up through the repetition of the sounds. In order to create a sequential transformation, you need to listen carefully to the 2 sounds that you want to morph between and create sequential versions of the sounds that are modified to sound more like the other sound that you're transforming. Use one sound as a starting point and the other as an end point for the transformation. You then work from each end, modifying the sounds so that they sound more like each other on each repeat. Transformations between sounds are then used to build up the structure of a piece of music through producing a narrative arc. To build up a sequence based on the sounds of the book and flying birds discussed previously, we might hear the sound of a book in an office environment. We hear the pages being flicked by a protagonist. Another sound is introduced to give a sense that an idea has been sparked by the book. And then the page's flicking sound transforms into the sound of birds flying away, giving the listener the sense that the idea has taken flight. This sequence would form a narrative arc that can then be elaborated on to complete our piece of music with other ideas. Other sequences could be added to it to lengthen it, and additional layers could be added to form the final piece. Below this video, you can listen to the result of our recipe. The piece you'll hear has the narrative arc based on the book and the bird sounds at the beginning, and then it's lengthened to create a full work. The short composition is based on the work Redbird by Trevor Wishart, which was written between 1974 and 1977. In our next video, we'll introduce a recipe for a more familiar style of electronic music, drum and bass, with DJ Tim Witt.